Hello everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Sermon Scraps. We dug into Psalm 9 this week, and as I mentioned at the beginning, Psalm 9 is an acrostic, so I thought I'd just show you quick. If you look at it's backwards, it's really hard to do. So over there it is, over here, that's the prescript, the of David part, and then you got Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and that's all of the Hebrew letters that I remember. I've completely forgotten it. So if you look through there, if you knew Hebrew, you'd be able to see that it's an acrostic, starting with the very beginning of the alphabet, working its way all the way to the end by the time you get to the end of Psalm chapter 10. You know, it's kind of funny. Someone emailed me. I talked about the Wizard of Oz and how God is giving us a glimpse behind the curtain here, that all the nations of the world are just people. There's nothing, we don't have to be afraid of them. There's nothing to fear from them because they're comprised of people. And someone sent me a bad summary of the Wizard of Oz. So there's I don't know if you've seen them, but some people sometimes will post these bad summaries of movies. Like one of the ones I saw was related to Lord of the Rings. It says someone stole a ring and led to an epic fight about it. Pretty good bad summary of it. So the one I got about Oz said, transported to a surreal landscape, a young girl kills the first person she meets and then teams up with 3 strangers to kill again. I thought that was a pretty good summary of what actually happened in Oz. So back into Psalm 9 here. See, it's an acrostic, so a lot of artistry, a lot of intentionality, a lot of beauty went into creating this psalm from David. He took time, effort, and intentionality to put this together. And I also thought it was interesting. So one of the early sections, so remember it's prayer for past deliverance in verses 1 through 12, and then prayer for present deliverance in verses 13 through 20. In the enemies section of the first part, so verses 3 through 6, he says, when my enemies have turned back, they stumble and perish before your presence. But then he can hardly even talk about his enemies before he goes right into God. So one verse 3 is about his enemies, and then for you have, verse 4, you have, all the way through. So all these ideas about the enemies just keep going back to God. And ultimately, it says that the very end of verse 6, the very memory of them has perished. Now what's crazy about that is most of the time the very memory of them is just ingrained, imprinted in our minds. But what this is pointing us to is this inaugurated eschatological reality. So that's a big fancy theological term. It's your quarter cent term of the day. So inaugurated eschatology is that eschatology, the end times, has already been inaugurated, has already begun. So we already live in the last days. Ever since Jesus ascended into heaven, it's what theologians refer to as the last days. We have lived in that since Jesus went to heaven. So what David is talking about here is the enemies have not yet been blotted out, but when we get to heaven, when the eschaton, the end times, the last days finally are completed, then our focus will be exclusively and primarily on God. We won't even give a second thought. The memory will be blotted out of those who were opposed, who were anti-God in this world. And then Jesus talks about, I didn't really have a chance to dig into this. Verse 9 talks about the Lord being a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Now, I think it's important to keep that idea in your mind. I mean, think of a song like The Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. That's getting to the same idea of God being a stronghold for us. And what I was thinking about as I read through that text was the story of martyrs, people who have been killed for believing in God. How many of them, as they were being tortured, as they were being put on trial, many times unjustly, ended up relying solely on God. So when something like the term stronghold comes up, it's referring to a place where storms can be weathered, where you can be sheltered, where no matter what else is going on around you, or maybe even internally within yourself and your very own life, God is still a stronghold. A place where you can be comforted, where you can be assured of the salvation that is coming from God. That's what God is talking about when he describes himself here as a stronghold. Then in verse 10 it says, those who know your name put their trust in you, for you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Now, again, there's this relational aspect that we need between us and God. So that leads us to the question, do you have that relationship with God? And it also is comforting. It says, for you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Because if you ask, God will answer. God will meet you. He will not leave you empty-handed. So reach out to him. Look to him. Reach out and ask him to be your stronghold. Now, verse 11 says, sing praises to the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the peoples his deeds. We actually need to bear witness, to testify, to give testimony to what God is doing in our lives. That's actually part of the reason that we meet together regularly as the church. Part of the reason we have a church, part of the reason we are a part of a church is to allow us to share how God is working in our lives. So therefore, we are commanded or exhorted to actually share what God is doing and how God is working out in our lives. So do you share how God has blessed you? That's part of the reason we talked about small groups this week. If you're not in a small group, it's really important. It's a really good way to, first of all, get to know people. Second of all, have accountability, support, encouragement. But third of all, share with each other how God is working in your lives. It also says, verse 12, he who avenges blood is mindful of them. He who does not cry out for the afflicted. Now, this is some of the idea. I mean, if you think back to Genesis, when Cain and Abel have their conflict, Cain kills Abel, and it says that his blood cries out to God. So even blood, the blood that seeps out of people can cry out to God. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, wrote that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. What he's talking about there is as the early Christians poured out their blood, it became the seeds from which the church was able to grow, because people died for their faith, for their belief in Jesus Christ. I mean, we're seeing that happening in Afghanistan right now. Our brothers and sisters there are dying because of their beliefs in Jesus Christ. Another book I think I've mentioned before, it kind of talks about some of these ideas as well. It's called The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. Rodney is a sociologist, actually serves at Baylor in Waco, Texas now. First started writing this book when he was an unbeliever. And through his studying and preparing of that book, he describes it as writing himself into faith. So Rodney is now a believer today. The subtitle is How the Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. So he's trying to trace this idea. How did Christianity come to take over the entire Roman world? Within 300 years, it became the primary religion of the Roman Empire. And part of the reason I think it's fascinating that the early Christians grew as rapidly as they did is because of how they dealt with the plague. So plagues would come through pretty regularly. There's bad living conditions, sewage running through the streets. Now, they did the best they could, but what would generally happen is when a plague would start coming through a city, all the rich people would abandon it, and they would just go out to the countryside. They would, because they didn't have the same working knowledge of germ theory, all of those kinds of things, ideas that we know and are aware of today. So one of the best ways to prevent yourself from getting sick is just leaving, because everyone's in close proximity in the cities. But what Christians would do is they would actually go out and grab the sick and take care of them. They'd feed them, they'd clothe them, they'd put water on their heads to ensure that they would remain healthy. And that has been the encouragement, the urge for us as Christians today. I mean, it's fascinating looking around at a lot of the names of the hospitals, even in the United States today. They're often founded by Christians. The idea of a hospital is from the Christian idea of hospitality. It's providing care and concern for one another. There's a quote I found from Luther sometime last year where he was talking about the need, if he wished that there was a place that we could send sick people where people could just take care of them together. But right now, since they didn't have that, then they would do that as the church together. Well, now we have that, which is a huge blessing, a huge marvel, something for us to celebrate. But at the same time, let's not neglect to care for, as James... Sorry, I bumped a button there. So as James 1:7 reminds us, let's not neglect to care for those that our society deems poor or not worthy of care. That's what we as Christians are called to do. Also in verse 12, I thought it was really funny. He does not forget. All I could think about when I read that was an elephant. So God is like an elephant in that he never forgets. All right, verses 13 and 14, David asks God to be gracious to me. Verse 14, so that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. When God is gracious, when God saves us, when God works in our lives to carry us through and out of affliction, do you turn back and praise him, or do you go right back to the way you've always been? Part of the need for us as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death that we'll see in 2 years in Psalm 23, even walking through the valley of the shadow of death is meant to refine us, to strip us away from impurities, and to conform us more into the image of his Son. So even in the midst of those things, when God is gracious to us, do you return to him and praise him, or do you just get through and then get back to the way things used to be in your life? Verse 18, the needy shall not always be forgotten, the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. I mentioned out of Psalm 7 to go read the Beatitudes, and I thought I would just read the beginnings of them today. So in Matthew chapter 5, verses 2 through 12, here's what it says. He, that is Jesus, opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Righteousness, that we've talked about that a lot in these Psalms. Righteousness is one of those gifts that is given to God for us, for our behalf. We cannot be righteous apart from him. So that's verse 6. Who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the poor, pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Verse 9 really stood out to me as I was reading and thinking about this. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Are we actually peacemakers? Or are we continuing to stir up the same division and discord that is just so rampant in our world today? I would encourage you, take time, ponder, reflect about the realities of the Beatitudes that Jesus is commanding us to obey in Matthew chapter 5. What else? Oh, lastly, he ends by picking up a very similar theme to Psalm 2. The question is, who do you trust in your life? Are you putting your trust in the things of this world, your bank account, the country you live in, therefore the size of the army that we have, your house? What is it that you're putting your trust in? And another Psalms that we'll be looking at, it says, some trust in chariots and some trust in horses. That is the army size of the day. But we trust in the Lord our God. So are we trusting in God, or... Sorry, then the program crashed. So, as a summary, are you trusting in the things of this world, or are you trusting in God? So, next week, Pastor Bruce is actually going to be preaching on the need for us to be involved and engaged in small groups. So I'd encourage you to come back. He's going to be just sharing some from his heart about why he is so passionate about small groups, why we have small groups, what the point and the purpose is for them. So we're taking a little bit of a break, just 1 week from our Psalm series. We're going to wrap up Psalm 10 the first week of September, and then we're going to be looking at the first 11 chapters in Genesis this fall. So I hope the Psalms have been encouraging and edifying for you. We're almost done. I hope the journal Bibles have been helpful for you, and don't forget to hold on to those because we're going to pick up in Psalm 11 next summer. Hope you all have a wonderful week. Lord willing, we'll see you all on Sunday.